He is the immediate past chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire, where he taught and performed research in areas including radio frequency engineering and biomedical engineering. He is here tonight to tell us about his experience serving on the New Hampshire Commission tasked with exploring the health and environmental effects of wireless radiation. Thank you so much, Dr. Kent Chamberlin.
Thank you, Courtney. And I think you can tell from the introduction that I'm not anti-high-tech at all. In fact, since leaving the university, I've been a founder in a high-tech startup company. And when I joined the commission, was asked to join the commission, my view was that electromagnetic waves, what's the big deal? No problem. And found out pretty early on in the commission that that simply was not true. So if I came into the commission with a bias, it was for high tech. Now, the findings of the commission, that is that wireless radiation is harmful, that's the bad news. We love our cell phones. But the good news is that we can do a lot about it, but we have to recognize that there is a problem before we can move forward. By the way, this phone is in airplane Wi-Fi mode, so it radiates a lot less than a traditional cell phone. So another thing I should tell you is that kind of a conflict of interest statement. You're going to be hearing from a lot of people about this issue. In fact, you'll be hearing from the wireless industry that there is no harm. In fact, you've heard that already from exposure to wireless radiation. And so that I feel like I need to say, I'm not getting paid by anybody. I'm doing this for free because I have a message to deliver learned in the New Hampshire Commission that I feel everybody should know. So having said that, let's get on with the slides and let me show you what that commission was all about and what our findings were. So here we go. So first thing is what is the commission and why was it formed? Well, it was formed through a bipartisan legislation. And by the way, these slides will be made available to you and the hyperlinks are active. So if you want to see what that legislation looked like, you can simply click on that link once you get the slides. And so it was, bipartisan, both houses of the legislature, and it was signed by our Republican governor. And why was it formed? Well, the reason is that it was formed is because legislators were hearing from industry, man, there's no problem. Wireless radiation is harmless, yet they were hearing from their constituents that, nah, it's harmful. It's harming us. And here's the scientific proof to back it up. So legislators were getting information from both sides, and they said, hey, the way to find out the truth in this matter is to form a bipartisan commission of experts who are unbiased because we're not going to pay them and industry is not going to pay them. So let's bring them on board. I should also note that this is the first legislation that's been passed in the United States to look at this issue. But I've been contacted by other states, as I was told, was telling Congressman Thenadar, that they're interested in forming their own commissions. So there's going to be a lot of follow-on on this. But for our commission, we passed the legislation to form the commission, and then we got 13 members out of it. And the legislation that formed the commission was very specific about what type of expertise we needed to have on board. And so what we ended up with, as you can see on the slide, is we had people in medicine. We had actually two legislators in New Hampshire were medical doctors. So we had that physics, toxicology, electromagnetics. That was me. Epidemiology. You can see that. But the bottom line is at the end, we had a commission comprised of experts that really had the expertise to answer the questions that were asked of them. So how did we do that? Well, the first thing, as you might imagine, would make sense, was to look at the peer-reviewed papers, journals. And you notice the word vetted there. So that's what we wanted to do also, is make sure that we were looking at quality publications and then use them to draw our conclusions. So what happened is, after looking at lots and lots of them, hundreds of them actually, we found that there were in a lot of top-tier journals. Now, I could spend a whole 20 minutes talking about how we vetted the journals, but we identified top-tier journals, and lots of them, that identified the harm of wireless radiation. And the second point here is that it wasn't just a few papers that we identified. We identified lots of them. In fact, over 90% of the papers that have been reviewed show harm from oxidative stress, and I'll say a little bit more about that too. So I'd like to address these two bullet items. The first is that there are lots of top-tier journals that contain articles that describe the harm associated with wireless radiation exposure. And the second bullet says that they're not in the minority. Those articles showing harm are not in the minority at all. They're in the majority, like 90%. So if anybody tells you that the only articles that show harm from wireless radiation are cherry-picked from fringe journals, clearly they haven't done their homework. So that's one of the first things that we found in the commission. Lots of top-tier journals that showed harm from wireless radiation. Now, I mentioned oxidative stress because that's considered to be the mechanism that causes harm from wireless radiation. Again, that could be a whole hour or two to describe that connection. But these articles that I pointed out above, they do show that the harm is oxidative stress. And oxidative stress creates free radicals. And that's something I think we've all heard about. We don't want free radicals, and so we eat blueberries and take the right supplements to lower our load of free radicals. Because one of the problems with free radicals is they create chronic inflammation, and that chronic inflammation leads to the diseases shown here. Now, this is just an abbreviated list of the diseases that can come about from an excess of free radicals leading to chronic inflammation. And if you click on any of those links, I only put down one link per disease, but you get a sense early on that these are top-notch journals, and they're describing some very nasty problems, very nasty diseases. So we know the mechanism. We can see in the peer-reviewed journal that there are lots of documentation associating the harms of wireless radiation to these types of diseases. Now, after looking at these, one other thing that we, the commission, looked at to determine whether or not there was problems, we brought in experts. So we brought in experts in fields related to the radiation exposure, wireless radiation, and harm. And of the 9 experts we brought in, only one of them said that there wasn't a problem with wireless radiation exposure. And not surprisingly, that one expert was from the telecommunications industry, was paid for by the telecommunications industry. And that was the only expert who was paid to present to our commission. So continuing with the processes, like I say, we early on found that there was a problem. So you say, well, why isn't the FCC, why aren't the other agencies doing something about this? So we contacted them, as you might expect, and we asked them to come visit with the commission. Now, you would think that a formal state commission convened through bipartisan legislation and all that good stuff, you think that we would be able to bring somebody in from a commission, a federal commission, and that was not the case. We had email exchanges. They sent us to websites. We never got our questions answered. And I think that one of the speakers later on will talk about why that is the case. And right now, I'll simply say that we, the commission, tried to do what we could to bring them on board, to find out why they weren't protecting us, and we never got anywhere with that. So we came up with a final report. That was in November 2020, actually November 1st, 2020. And our report was 390 pages. If you want to click on the link, you don't have to read the 390 pages. You can get, 20 pages or so. You really get a good feel of what our recommendations were and what our findings were, because most of the report, as is true with most of reports of this type, it was appendices. So let's talk about some of those recommendations. These are 5 out of the 15. Issue a resolution. We felt that the problem like this had to be attacked at the federal level. So we wanted to engage our federal delegation to do something about it. And I won't say that we struck out completely, but we were advised that may not prove to be the most fruitful approach. So we did some work on this at the state level. And we can talk more about that later in the questions and answers. We also wanted to engage federal agencies in developing safety limits that will protect. And notice here, trees, plants, birds, insects, because something else the commission found is that wireless radiation is not only harmful to humans, particularly children, but also to the environment, to the birds and bees and the trees and all that. And so this is a significant problem. In fact, if you put a cell tower around trees, you're going to see those trees in the vicinity degrade, and sometimes fairly quickly. So that was something else we thought maybe go to the EPA for that. And we also wanted to come up with a setback. And so what we determined is that a 500-meter setback, which is 1,640 feet, if you were that far from a tower or farther, you were probably relatively safe from the radiation created by that tower. And we also wanted to come up with RF education zones, or I'm sorry, safe zones in buildings. I don't have time to talk about electrosensitivity, but it's a very real thing, and it affects a substantial portion of our population, and all indications are that an increasing number of people are going to be affected by electrosensitivity. And what that means for these people is they can't be in a room with a working cell phone or Wi-Fi. If they went into a room with a router, they would be in big trouble. They'd get sick, and they would probably have to leave. Not probably, they would have to leave. So we felt on the commission that there should be safe zones in places, particularly schools and hospitals, government buildings, where people who are electrosensitive can go for some reprieve, a refuge. And also we wanted to have we wanted to minimize exposure, and also tell people how to minimize their own exposure. As I mentioned, by putting my phone in a Wi-Fi mode, I'm having far less exposure than if it were in the cellular mode. So there are lots of things you can do. One of them is put policies in place that keep the cell towers out of people's backyards. But there are a lot of things that can be done, and we need to let people know what those things are. So education is a very big part of what we wanted to recommend, what we did recommend. So you need to hear this. I think no talk about what we found on the commission would be complete without talking about how the current guidelines were set. I remain shocked every time I go through this. So here's what happened. So the limits were set in the 1980s, and they're based on short-term studies. When I say short-term, I'm talking about 1 hour or slightly less. And this is, as you can see, they were based on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. And you want to read more about it, they've got the reference right here. So the assumption is that the only harm that happens as a result of wireless radiation exposure is that it might heat you up and in the short term. So that was their starting assumption. So what they did to test that out and find out the level of exposure where that would happen is they took these rats and monkeys separately, and they food deprived them. These are rats and monkeys that had been trained to push a lever to get food. So they were food deprived at the beginning. They then put them in an enclosure and kept ramping up their exposure to electromagnetic fields, kind of like putting them in a microwave oven and cranking up the power. And the level at which the rats and monkeys could no longer perform this simple task of pushing a lever, even though they were hungry, the point at which they could no longer do that was determined as being the upper limit of exposure. I kid you not. And they then took that number and they divided it by 50, and they said that should be enough of a safety factor for the population in general. Those are the standards that are in place today. And it is ridiculous as that sounds. I mean, it's like asking somebody to smoke a pack of cigarettes and within an hour period of time, if they live, you say, hey, cigarettes are safe. So these limits that are described on this slide are what are in place for the 24/7 exposure that we get today. I mean, it just seems to be totally ridiculous to me. I can imagine that most of you have the same opinion as you hear this. So, concluding remarks, the formal state commission, comprised of unbiased experts, formed through bipartisan legislation, concluded that low-level microwave radiation is harmful, period, to human health and the environment. And here's something that we're advocating. There are lots of great technologies out there, a lot of things we can do to protect people. Remember that when engineers, like myself, were asked to design these systems, we were never asked to minimize radiation. In fact, the main thing was to make these communicate effectively, and they do. They're incredible technology, but their radiation does harm people, and now we know how to reduce that, and so that should be pursued. And things like, and I'm very much an advocate of migrating to fiber. There are great examples of cities that have adopted fiber over wireless, and they've done just well with it. And I could go, that again is another presentation on why fiber is so far superior to wireless solutions. And finally, my recommendation, based upon what I know, citizen to citizen, from what I learned on that commission, is that if you're in a position to protect the population from excessive wireless exposure, please do so. And that concludes my presentation.